Hello, and welcome to International Relations in Focus. The British military has been in the news a lot of late, whether it be down to airstrikes on the Houthis in Yemen, alleged woke infiltration of the institutions, capability deficiencies, or recruitment issues. But to try and get some kind of broader perspective on these issues, I spoke to Dr Frank Ledwidge, a retired naval officer and academic. Frank in the past has written 2 influential books on recent British military intervention, Losing Small Wars and Investment in Blood, the links to which are in the description below. I hope you find the interview with Frank as fascinating as I did, where we discussed the future of the British military, how it came to occupy its current position, and indeed the future of overall British strategic vision and that of the West more broadly. Just a slight caveat that, due to microphone issues in the last 10 to 15 minutes or so, the sound quality does deteriorate slightly, but it's still perfectly audible. I really welcome your comments below once you've watched the interview, anything you want to contribute, and I hope you enjoy this first episode of International Relations in Focus. If you do, please like, subscribe, and we'll be back soon with more interviews and insight. Thank you. Today, we're joined by Dr. Frank Ledwidge, a former military intelligence officer who served in the Balkans, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He's also a trained barrister and a senior fellow at the University of Portsmouth. Frank, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure, Ewan.
I'd like to begin by reading you a passage from your book, Losing Small Wars. It's in the introduction. While I had few illusions about the role I could play, typically it takes decades for the results of justice development to become apparent, I was confident when I arrived that the British military forces had the measure of the enemy. And then shortly after that, you also say, there were problems, such as language and the tendency to overlay every political and military problem with Northern Ireland analogies, but these could be overcome, I thought. For me, reading at the beginning of the book and then reading over the course of it, it seems less a case of innocence lost and more of disillusionment gained. Is that a fair reflection?
When I came back from Helmand, which was in late 2007, I think there was some level of disillusionment, as you call it, in how I thought of it. That increased actually very quickly within a couple of months when I realised that, when it started to sink in with conversations with, amongst other, let me say, very senior civilian officials and some of my colleagues and friends in Helmand, the depths of ignorance from which this campaign was being conducted, and the level of dishonesty, both at a tactical and indeed a strategic level, that was being lay behind this. I'd seen that when I was there, not only in the context of a so-called justice advisor, which would be some form of stabilisation officer, justice and security. The budget from which I was being paid was the counter-narcotics budget. For example, let me just touch on that. The level of asinine overconfidence and bottomless ignorance from which we worked might be indicated by one vignette. I spoke to one of the senior prosecutors in the province quite regularly. He was a jolly fellow, spoke good English. He'd been trained allegedly during the American period, Little America, which was the US were involved very heavily in Helmand for a long time. And I asked him to ring on just so we could check them through, both as lawyers. I'd prosecuted for a long time, and see the state of some of these very weighty prosecutions that are being conducted against the serious opium issue in Helmand. And he brought along a few bits of paper, clearly fully understanding how I'd received these, and not mocking, but certain a sense of self-mockery. And he said, these are my files. And they included, I think, a charge of possession of a couple of grams of marijuana and one or two balls of opium. And he said, those are my files. Knowing full well, of course, that this was ludicrous. And it was at that sort of level of self-deception, almost deliberate self-deception, the civilian effort was working out. I kind of assumed, as you hint there, that the military were at a different level, but of course they weren't. Yeah, that gave rise to that. And then that sort of sense started to turn into anger, really, as I started to reflect on the casualties we were suffering, and indeed the casualties we were inflicting on the people of that province, and contextualising that into how it might look if we were in the UK, Helmand being roughly the same size in that time population as Northern Ireland, where of course we had much trumpeted experience, as you hint. So the sequence, I won't go into detail because it's a bit tedious and there's lots of twistings and turnings, but the sequence was essentially, I proposed to some publishers. And then one publisher, Yale University Press, and I won't say the name of the editor, it's in the book, but she's an amazing woman. She said, have you got anything else in mind? And I drew on the story that I told you there, which also gave rise to more thinking about Iraq and why it was that we were actually inept and failing in both of those campaigns at that time. Both of them, it must be remembered, were going on. So I started writing in the late 9, finished in 11. So I suppose that's one way of telling the story.
And what were your conclusions? What were your diagnoses of the problems as you saw in the writing of those books?
There's a famous, at least for those involved in it, doyen of studies of legal development called Thomas Carruthers. He's an academic, American academic, and practitioner of that. And I was a bit of a follower of his one, involved in that work for many years in the former Soviet Union. And he describes the problem of knowledge in that sense of legal development within the whole bigger world of development, and how the rule of law fits into a society. And the central idea of that is that you really shouldn't play around in things you don't understand for any reason. You're better leaving things alone for them to develop organically. And at that time we were concerned with so-called counterinsurgency, and identified exactly the same problem. I think in the book it's mentioned, but ultimately we had no clue of not just simply the details of the environments into which we recklessly plunged, following and holding the tails of the Americans, but indeed even the issues at the strategic level. For example, the importance of the difference between Shia and Sunni, let's say, as a very easy example, but that within Basra was quite where I was quite crucial. And in Helmand, the problem, which was really identified by Mike Martin, my friend and colleague, later, that the Taliban was the least of our problems, least of our armed problems in Helmand, and instead the place was a patchwork of criminal, political, Islamist, and historical interests, none of which we understood. These are all symptoms of the problem of knowledge. It goes on till today. And we've just conducted, we, the UK, have just conducted air raids into Yemen, evidently failing to realise that the Saudis have been conducting similar raids for the last 7 years, but to no effect, but also without, I think, pretty certain, for various internal dynamics within the Ministry of Defence and our intelligence services, much the same reasons as we've always had, that the opportunity to gain deep expertise and local expertise is by now largely denied to us by virtue of the many wars that we've started and failed to finish in these areas. Problem of knowledge.
Do you think the UK Armed Forces have changed for the better or for the worse since you identified the problems you did in your books?
In terms of capabilities, it's self-evident, I think, that they have changed for the worse, in that the level of military equipment, and indeed personnel we have, it's probably about 60%, maybe push 70 in some cases, of that what it was of what it was in the sort of 2000 to early 2000s, 2010 or so. But I think in terms of the quality of personnel, the SO3s, the sort of captain level of the army, and below, are now filtering up into the senior ranks. I think that's evident, and I think we do see, there's no doubt about it, to my mind, a much higher quality of senior officer now than we saw then. However, there is the malaise of decades to clean out, and that won't be done quickly. And so the combination of the backwash of misfired campaigns, the ones I've mentioned and others, and I hesitate to use the term culture because there's more to culture, contested term anyway. I'd say just the definition of it, the stories we tell ourselves, those stories are still told, that we are a tier one, lower perhaps, tier one power, and we have responsibilities globally, and we're global Britain and all the other hogwash that we've heard over the last decade or so. So we still suffer from the legacies of that, and let's hope that those combination of those legacies, I think still a fairly serious problem in strategic thinking, don't come back to bite us. We're in a vulnerable position for the next decade or so, perhaps even more if the promises that have been made don't come true. So the next decade doesn't offer us too many challenges, because if they do, we can perhaps come on to those. We are in serious trouble. Serious trouble. Defeat will follow. Again. I take no pleasure in saying that. No pleasure at all. It's the whole thing is disgraceful and shameful.
How do you think we've got to this place?
Somebody described this to me who was an armed forces officer last week, I think very astutely, as the growing pains or the shrinking pains of a power that hasn't yet realised that it's sort of upper tier 3 or lower tier 2 rather than any sort of tier 1.
Is this an issue that's purely down to money, or are there deeper institutional issues in addition to lack of finance, allegedly?
Look, everybody knows that the major enemy of the Ministry of Defence is not Russia, China, or any other confected adversary, which have been many over the last 30 years. It's the Treasury. And every battle that they have fought with the Treasury, they've equipped themselves with foolish designs, let's say, and been defeated, and I think rightly so. If you were from the Treasury after the catastrophic procurement disasters that each service has inflicted upon themselves over the last 20 years, you can see why they get beaten every time. And of course, much of this derives out of tired thinking about what our role is, and still these undead ideas about Britain as a global military power able to project force, which we no longer, for our defence, need to do. So, is it a problem of money? Well, I suppose if you waste billions of pounds on an armoured car that doesn't work properly, instead of buying off the shelf like every other competent state in Europe.
What are you referring to exactly?
The Ajax. Or if you could also talk about Challenger 3 vis-a-vis the next iteration for the army of the Leopard, or let's be honest, I don't need to say anything more than Queen Elizabeth and Prince of Wales from that perspective.
The aircraft carriers.
The aircraft carriers, right, which epitomise everything. They were envisioned in the late 90s as, in the words of their intellectual father, Admiral Lord West, who came back from a conference, as I recall, in Norfolk, Virginia, saying that the American Chief of Staff had asked us, this is in the late 90s, where things were a lot different, asked us to be able, I can't remember his exact words were, but to produce something that could backfill an American carrier group, which at the time was probably fairly reasonable in conception, but things changed, of course. And all this was backed up by global Britain, the military aspects of global Britain, what's called now global Britain, and expeditionary warfare or comprehensive approach, all these buzzword bingo results that come out. So the carriers were commissioned to form the centre of a carrier group at a time where we probably could have afforded one. I'm not going to go through all the long, tedious story of the aircraft from the Joint Strike Fighter ordered in 2001, may get full operational capability next year in 2025, we'll see. Insufficient numbers, miscalculations about the equipment on the carriers, let's say, for a start, the launch systems that were initially envisaged. The fact that two of them were to exist at all was highly questionable. The French have one, of course, but perfectly well with one. Where else on that, before we get into the really important issues? Let's get into those. There's an assumption that you can provide protection for these very expensive large items. There's an assumption you can provide the enablers. None of these exist now. We can't protect them organically with British assets, and we can't supply them organically with British assets because they have been cut to the bone. We can't crew them. The crew of one carrier would man or provide crews for, conservatively 4 or 5 destroyers or frigates, which we don't have anyway. But even if we did, we couldn't crew them because of the demands of these huge behemoths. It's probably worth mentioning from a historical perspective the unfortunate naming of these two white elephants. First, Queen Elizabeth sunk in Alexandria Harbour at a most important time in the Second World War by Italian divers. She was refloated and served again, but we lost her at a very crucial time. Her damage shifted the balance of power for some time in the Mediterranean. So that's a bit of perhaps an unfortunate predecessor. But much more historically resonant is the destruction and sinking of the Prince of Wales in January 1942 by a surprise attack by Japan's Air Force and Navy. I can't remember which service, Navy I think, and which completely destroyed Britain's naval forces or naval power, along with the loss of Singapore, very closely connected, at that period. So even the naming speaks of something. These are, to my mind, indicative. And above all, of course, these things are designed to carry up to 3-4 squadrons of jets. Neither of them have deployed with more than 8 aircraft, not squadrons. I don't want to get too nerdy about it, but viewers can look at the specifications of the now 3 Chinese carriers in service, soon to be joined by a 4th very large equivalent or very large carrier, which so far all of them are smaller than ours and can deploy 3 or 4 times the number of fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters. And he mentioned the American carrier groups, bearing in mind, of course, that our carriers were supposed to backfill. So one of our carriers in its group was supposed to substitute, or was originally envisaged to substitute for an American carrier group. It's impossible now. These are the ships that have sunk the Royal Navy, and they themselves arose out of this idea that we could be a global military power able to deploy worldwide without damaging our key and first duty, or without compromising our key and first duty, which is the defence of the homeland. And the defence of the homeland now is a desperate need, and we find ourselves I think almost entirely incapable of answering that need at the moment because of the displacement activity represented very literally by these large white elephants. Apart from that, they're great. I mean, I asked, I found myself in the MOD on whatever floor it was. They determine what they call strategy. I asked a senior naval officer, I said, what's the general strategic approach behind these carriers? I mean, are you looking at Mahan or Corvette? I mean, from which particular tradition are you drawing your strategy? He said, well, Frank, what you need to understand is that what the Ukraine war has taught us is it's very good to have airfields that can move around. Because, of course, you can target airfields, which the obvious response is, well, perhaps the better idea is to have aircraft that can move around, airfields that cannot be sunk. But there you have it. And then we could come, of course, to the agile combat employment, which the Air Force is pinning its hopes on to substitute for the lack of an integrated air and missile defence system for our country. Again, a result of a failure by successive governments and defence structures to answer that first duty, which is to defend the homeland and territories of the British people. We've failed to do that. The French haven't. The French have an excellent air and missile defence system. We have an excellent tradition ourselves up to about 1995 of having such a system. We don't have it now because we've sunk all our resources into these boondoggles that have sucked the life out of every other, particularly homeland defence assets.
To try and be charitable, could it be argued that Western defence priorities are now radically different since Iraq and Afghanistan, or certainly Afghanistan, and that everyone is racing to try and keep up in an ever-changing geostrategic environment? Does this influence your diagnosis in any way? Is there a degree of sympathy that, as you say, the late 90s, when the carriers were thought up, was a different time, and no one could have foreseen the war on terror, never mind everything that's happened since. And so we're racing to try and catch up to an ever-moving target, and therefore is there a degree of sympathy to the argument that we're going to get things wrong on occasions as a result of that? Or are you unsympathetic?
No, entirely unsympathetic. We haven't got anything right. I mean, even the procurement of the carriers, which, by the way, I mean, look, I'm not blaming individuals here. I'm blaming the stories we tell ourselves. And the story I told myself when I was at Staff College in the early 2000s was that it's great. We're going to get I thought at that point, I think we're going to get one. We're going to get a nice carrier. We're going to get, with a full air wing, and it'll be great. We can do what we did in the late 70s. But the assumption there was we'd also be able to do or fulfil the main duty of Royal Navy, which for the main and leading duty, and only the essential one, which is guardianship of our sea lanes, and which we sort of in the early 2000s probably had just enough to be able to begin to think about. And it was nice to have a carrier as well to support that. But of course, this grew into what I've described. But back to your question, no. The first duty of any government and any military is the defence of its homeland and people. And the armed forces we have now are not capable of doing that. It's fairly simple and straightforward. Do that first, then you can play around in the Arab world or ludicrously East Asia and believe yourself to be a player in either theatre. We could get on to Yemen and where we are there in a moment, if you like. But look, I wouldn't have, would I have made different decisions? Well, probably I would. I mean, in the book, Losing Small Wars, I think in the conclusion I write that perhaps, I wrote this 2010, that perhaps instead of meddling in the sands of Central Asia or the Arab world, we might return to the Ministry of Defence might return to its advertised role, which is defence. But look, it's not like the view that I'm taking now that the first duty of a government and defence forces is the defence of the homeland is accepted now. No, we still have ideas of extensive military activities east of Suez, all of which detract from the essential and single priority of defence, which I've already outlined and won't mention again. As an additional comment, we see now all services frantically trying to re-engineer themselves to produce something resembling at least the kind of force that's required in an environment which, if we do have a military threat, exists only in northwestern Europe, or at least from our perspective, northwestern Europe, which is where we are, oddly enough. And it's like some people would say, and they say, oh, it's simplistic. I mean, this is a very radical view. How is it a radical view? This was the view held from 1949, when NATO was founded, until the mid-90s. That was the purpose of armed forces for all those that 50 years or more. Purpose of armed forces and the function for which they were designed and which they fulfilled extremely well was defence of our sea lanes and our airspace and our European allies. That was it. Any by-blows such as the Falklands were carried out drawing on those assets. We couldn't do now, of course, by the way.
Well, that was going to be, just harking back a question I had, is that as an island nation, surely the broad history of our warfare or defending ourselves has been in expeditionary. For example, we were defending ourselves by sending expeditionary forces at the outbreak of the Great War, before Dunkirk, and so forth. So I would imagine, again, I'm trying to be devil's advocate here, that people would say, well, we are defending ourselves by sending out expeditionary forces to meet the threats wherever they be found, whether it be the Middle East. And to take your point on Yemen, I imagine the logic of that is that the trade through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal is essential to not only UK but broader European economic trade and prosperity, and therefore sending the naval and air power forces to conduct operations in that part of the world therefore protects our domestic economic security. Do you see where I'm trying to go on that one? Just as a devil's advocate argument.
Absolutely. No, it's a very fine argument if you can make it work. And if you can do that, or indeed if our activities are contributing to that, it's interesting, isn't it, that Germany, Italy, Spain and France are not involved in these military operations, although they face very much the same challenges in terms of trade that we do. And there are not particularly radical political solutions to the Houthi problem, which seem very evident to me. I'll come back to the point about where we were historically in a second. I was at a conference recently where a senior Royal Air Force officer marvelled at the fact that a number of Typhoon aircraft led by a fairly junior officer had achieved strategic effect in Yemen. It was a mystery to me what strategic effect this very fine and impressive officer, and he was, thought that this had achieved, except to prove to the Arab world that Britain was now fighting for the Israeli, as they would consider them, génocidaires. Anybody who'd lived in the Arab world for more than a few weeks would appreciate that's exactly how almost all Arabs and very, very many Muslims in the world, perhaps somewhere north of 90%, would see this. Now, how that's a positive strategic result for the UK to be seen as ineffectively, by the way, conducting military operations with producing that strategic result, marvellously repeating problems and mistakes that we made 15 years ago in another context. It's amazing to me. That seems to be self-evident, the strategic effect of doing that. Certainly hasn't resulted in the reopening of the Red Sea approaches, has it? And nor will it. Indeed, President Biden himself said that the raids hadn't worked, and when asked were they going to continue, he said, yes, let's see where this goes and see how successful it is. If at some point the Houthis say, yes, you're quite right, we don't want any more of those bombs well targeted on where we've left our gear, having been warned that they were to be attacked and having hit all our gear and being unable to be reinforced, we give up, we surrender. You can carry on with your passage through the Red Sea unimpeded. Is that going to happen? No, of course it isn't. They fought 7 years hard and effectively against the Saudis and UAE, who also, by the way, Saudis, as far as I know, are not involved in this either, bizarrely. Okay, back to your first point then. We did send expeditions globally, and we were very capable of doing that with a navy bigger and more effective than the rest of the world put together, and deliberately so. That's how it was structured. in 1934. We also had something then which we don't have now, which is an empire consisting of, I think at that time, about a quarter of the world's surface. So, without wishing to draw on cliches about imperial nostalgia, which I don't necessarily think we have, that was the foundation for such operations in those days. I don't think we have imperial nostalgia. I think what we have is this continuing and highly damaging idea that we have to be doing all things everywhere, which is a slightly different form of self-deception than imperial nostalgia.
What would it take to fix the issues you've identified, and are we capable of doing so?
It would take a laser focus on priorities. None of our strategies, defence strategies, are expressed in the integrated review. The integrated review refreshed the SDSR, the SDSRs and the SDR before that have expressed strategic priorities, and except in rhetorical terms, certainly haven't resulted in any change in defence policy, deployment or procurement. And I hear this constantly. It's about time, isn't it, we prioritise. And once you've established your priorities, you can equip your armed forces accordingly. And we've not prioritised. The priority has not been on a geographical area or any particular purpose. It's been on a function, which is to produce expeditionary capability centred around such things as the carriers, the expeditionary air wings, or whatever the iterations of the various brigades that the army have been trying to produce. And of course, for their perspective, things like the Rangers, the bloated special forces we have, and the various other families of exceptionalist units that they've got, which again draw away from the main role, which is to provide, oddly enough, a defence for Europe in my view. But that priority hasn't yet been articulated. Let's hope that the next one of the many recent integrated reviews, or whatever it's called, will establish a very firm priority and equip the armed forces over the next few years accordingly. So to answer your question, it's a lack of prioritisation, and certainly a lack of, even if one can identify prioritisation, effective prioritisation. In other words, establishing a priority and acting accordingly. And that priority should be, by dint of the fact we can't afford to do everything anywhere else, and certainly not to execute effective expeditionary operations with any form of strategic coherence, which is to say, understanding what we're going to get, what we're trying to get out of it, and how we're going to get out of that. Then we have to focus on the first duty, which is the defence of the homeland of our territories.
So, without addressing these issues, or even if we do, how does the UK currently compare to our adversaries? Are we capable of winning conflicts anymore, whether it be against state or non-state actors?
Well, let's look at what we have. The army can deploy to Europe 2 brigades. It undertook in 2010 to be able to deploy a fully accoutered combat division to anywhere actually, but specifically to Europe. Hasn't got the people or the gear for that. And it certainly can't rule them around, can't replace them in the event of casualties, which of course would be very many in any kind of war. Now, let's hope that there'll be no war, but there's less likely to be a war if there's an effective deterrence. British Army do not offer effective deterrence at the moment to any potential adversary. And the adversary I'm talking about, of course, is Russia. Now, I don't believe that Russia's going to roll over Estonia anytime soon, or indeed into Poland. It's perfectly capable, given an extremely hard time, to put it lightly. They're taking defence very seriously. And what are they defending? Their homeland, which is what we should be doing. So that's the army then. So the army can possibly deploy 2 brigades, about 10,000 people, but it can't replace them with it. It probably might be able to do so in a year or so. The Navy, well, I've laboured the point on the Navy. They've got usually seven frigates and destroyers if they're working, of course. I haven't even dealt with the maintenance, disgraceful maintenance problems that the Navy finds itself labouring under, particularly in the aircraft carriers. But let's assume that all ships work as advertised, which they don't, and they can be crewed, which they can't. The Navy can deploy about 7, maybe 8 at a push frigates and destroyers to guard, well, indeed, to fulfil all the Navy's obligations. Those are the major combat vessels, of course, laboured the carriers to death. And the Air Force. Well, as one senior NCO said to me quite recently, it's unfortunate that we don't have an integrated air and missile defence system in this country, which countries such as France do have. Poland is developing. Germany doesn't. Norway has. And we don't. So, and of course the major threat to us is submarines, which is a joint air and naval obligation. The Air Force can deploy one or maybe two to push. Really, that would be pushing it. Maritime patrol aircraft at the time, that would be really pushing it, usually one. The Navy might be able to deploy one submarine, which is the most effective anti-submarine platform. A couple of anti-submarine ships, if they can manage to put the right gear together to do that. And I'm thinking those towed arrays and what have you. And that would be the force we would direct against a Russian submarine force of several dozen effective submarines. Some of them very effective, at least as effective as ours. Yeah, that's before we get into the air threat.
The implication of your suggestion that we focus...
Sorry to interrupt. The problem with submarines isn't just that they're going to cut our supply lines or sever our cable network, cable assets. It's that they all deploy at a much greater scale than is now being deployed against Ukraine, dozens and dozens of cruise missiles, which have the capability of disabling all our military assets in Britain without effective defences. They're more than aware of this. So, for example, you could put two, let's say, Yasen-class submarines, which are roughly equivalent to our Astutes, roughly. Some say as quiet. I don't know. I'm not privy to that kind of information. But let's say they're not caught, which are unlikely to be. Each one can deploy 32 cruise missiles. That's 64. The fighters might shoot down a few. 50 cruise missiles on 6 Air Force bases, 3 naval bases. One on each would cause us serious problems, but it'd be a lot more than that. So that's just one, Walter Mitty-ish estimate from someone who really doesn't have any access to classified knowledge, but access to the open source. We don't have the capability to resist even that. 2 submarines would do that. So, as an example, there you go. Now, hopefully by the end of the decade, we might have the capabilities to be able to challenge that sort of thing if all the promises are fulfilled. I suspect it won't be.
Is it fair to say that based on your suggestions of consolidating defence of the homeland, that the implication is, frankly, reducing the army to shift resources to the Navy and the Air Force, being an island nation? I mean, traditionally, historically, the Army's always been the poor cousin of all the 3 services. Well, before the Air Force came along, the Navy used to get all the resources because we patrolled the global sea lanes. And of course, in times of actual conflict on the European continent, the Army then obviously gets boosted again. But is that a fair assumption to say that of the 3, the Army would lose out in order to boost the Air Force and the Navy?
The Army won't lose out because of the constant hair-pulling and backstabbing that goes on in the Ministry of Defence. The Army is very powerful. And of course, it will always preach that it has these unconventional capabilities that no one else allegedly has. But in terms of heavy metal, the Army has virtually nothing to offer Europe. I won't get into the numbers of it, but I think the idea of the Army as a bullet fired by the Navy, or now perhaps even the Air Force, is probably the best we could which is to say a relatively small force in the way you describe, is probably the best we could offer. In that case, of course, you would default to and rightly prioritising the naval and air force assets necessary to defend the homeland. Look, people say, "Oh, how Frank, awfully simplistic. No, we know threats exist all over the world. It must be dealt with globally." But they don't. The main threats to our homeland, in terms of military threat, exist from the Russian Navy. That's it. So what do you do to our homeland? What do? We prioritise, as you say, the Navy and the Air Force, much as we did during the Cold War. And we are constantly told that we're in a second Cold War now. The main adversary is Russia. What's the main threat of Russia to us? air-launched missiles and sea-launched missiles, and to a lesser extent the interdiction of our sea lanes, as ever was the case. And we could go back, if you want to be historical about this, to the Second World War. And what was the one crucial battle we had to win, according to Churchill? Battle of the Atlantic, and it took 6 years to do it. So, I could, in terms of historical precedent, we could also name the First World War, where that was also the one decisive theatre. Had we lost it, the rest wouldn't have mattered. Same now. So, to come back to your question, yes, we should be prioritising those elements of the armed forces which deal with the primary threats that are facing us and are likely to face us, and not try and produce some form of avatar of the British Army, the Rhine, or what have you, because we can't. We should do what we should be doing, and what we can do, and unfortunately, there's some things we cannot do. One of those is to build a large European ground-based task force. We can't do it. Just to put things in context, just numbers, again, platforms, they're very simple ones. I would ask our viewers to guess how many tanks we have in service at the moment. Challenger 2 tanks, which are getting a bit old now, have very good guns, but there we have it. So the answer is 56, I think, 2 regiments worth. There's a few more in reserve and what have you. The Polish army are putting together a force of, I think, somewhere short of 2,000. Very high-end, very capable, late-model Korean tanks, which are not to be messed with. Where do we fit in there?
So we've been talking almost in an analogue way in Army, Navy, Air Force.
Yes.
But in the 21st century, we're also adding cyber and space capabilities. Yes. Now, it's well recognised that the UK is a leader in tech industry and AI, GCHQ, and yes. so forth. Well, surely we can punch above our weight in the cyber and, to an extent, space domain.
Well, as a commanding officer, a former commanding officer at SAS once told me quite amusingly, he said, if you punch above your weight, you're likely to get knocked out. But that doesn't apply actually in cyber, because in cyber we are a superpower. We're not a military superpower, but we are a superpower across the spectrum with GCHQ. That is a very major asset we have, no doubt about it. Military cyber, look, I wouldn't subscribe to the characterisation of that by a good friend of mine who knows a bit about this stuff as amounting to a confused corporal in a tent trying to make his laptop work. I think there's a lot more to it than that, obviously. But backing it all up, of course, is a huge resources of what we do, of what is a Premier League asset, and that is GCHQ. Space, we are in the sort of higher end higher sort of Division 1 level, Championship and Premier League. Premier League is occupied by Russia. Russia's still just about, China certainly, and the US, of course, above all. Then we have the Championship, which would be Italy, France, India, Japan, arguably Australia, maybe. Australia, very strong cyber powers. No, maybe not so much in space. And we would sort of lead the third echelon there. Fortunately, our Space Command was set up commanded by a jet pilot, and not by a space specialist, but no doubt they can get over that. But it seems to be doing okay. I think we're very late setting up our space capabilities. The French renamed their Air Force, actually, Air and Space Force. The Russians already did that. Americans have their own service, and there are a few other air forces around who have either renamed their force to reflect the importance of space, or have very powerful space commands. So we're a bit late on that. Do we have the money for that? Well, there was a lot of publicity about that around the time of the integrated review and the refresh. The resources are being applied. There was nothing additional. Hopefully, the new review will prioritise space even more and add something to that. I don't think there's any buts there. It's growing. it's doing well, but I think it does need resourcing. And with the Ukraine war demonstrates, of course, the central importance of what anybody who's involved in space already knew of the space domain, and indeed cyber, needless to say. So yeah, that's where we are in those domains as far as I know. As I said, I have no access to any classified or discrete information on that.
Ideally, the makeup and posture of a country's armed forces should be complementary to an overall strategic vision. What would you say is the UK's strategic vision?
Confused. That's it. I've looked at the integrated review, the refresh, which is both of which are very well written, I must say, and internally coherent. The SDSR, 2015 was the last one, and the SDSR 2010, very similar. And the problem is in none of those are overriding priorities set, except in the rhetorical space, because there's no, if you have a system and the system produces one thing, it doesn't matter what the system says it's going to produce, it's actually producing something else. I think there certainly is a growing awareness, there's a lot of flapping going on about returning defensive capabilities to the homeland, if you see what I mean. In other words, increasing capabilities for defending our people as opposed to attacking other people, which has been rather more engaged in the last 3 decades. But then we hit this question of resources, and the fight of the armed forces, it's twofold within government, as any student of international relations will know. The first fight is with other services, and all services united against the Treasury, and then we look at enemies, and that is very unfortunate. Now, in my view, we could begin to cut out the first problem by purpling even more, and they are quite purple. I won't criticise the military too much on this. I think purple meaning we look at the armed forces as one defence force as opposed to 3 separate squabbling services, which is traditionally the case. I think it is the case, certainly above a certain level, that there's a lot more jointery, and that's really good. That's very positive, and that's been the case for some time.
Would you advocate for an actual formal institutionalisation, like dissolving 3 services and merging, or is that a recipe for disaster, given the embedded cultures?
Yeah, I think I mean, it appeals to me to do that, but I think you're right. I think there are embedded cultures, even now, that all the services are half the size they were when, certainly when I joined, it's a lot less than half the size. So then, but I think embedded cultures, and there are advantages in that, still clearly exist, and they're still just big enough for that to be important. If we shrink any further significantly, I think there's a case for, might be a case for the sort of Australian model where you have Australian Defence Forces. But the paradigm of this, and we'll put the Canadian case aside because they did try that and failed, and they're still trying to cope with it more successfully now than before. The paradigm case, of course, is the Israelis. And the different, whilst some Israeli strategists say, well, look what we've done and how effective it is, and they're right, that's how it developed. It was organic. And whilst there were struggles to make that happen, and it is essentially one defence force, and you don't have these inter-service squabbles that we have, I think our history militates against that. Interestingly, there was a review in the early 60s, it's the ISMA review, that gave rise to the Ministry of Defence. There was a recommendation to remove the service affiliation of officers that were 2-star or above. And I was discussing this with a very senior general the other day, who had extensive experience with this retired general. And he said, look, effectively we have that already. It was the one recommendation in the ISMA, ISMA report that was not carried through for in-service reasons in the early 60s. And I think the case for that is a little bit weaker than it initially looks, because I think in fairness we have got PJHQ, which governs the operational capability of our armed forces structurally, and that's a very purple setup. The difficulty comes, of course, with procurement, where you have competing interests squabbling away. I don't know how to solve that, I just don't have the knowledge, but I think people do. There's such institutional inertia, though, in all our government. institutions. It's very difficult to get past that. I think perhaps one solution might be really slimming down the procurement setup. Right now, Abbey Wood, which is the central procurement for British military, I think there are 20,000 people. The Israeli Defence Forces do that with a very small fraction. But how you would do that is something I don't know.
Staying on the subject of strategic visions, does the collective West have an overall vision where we generally row together in the same direction, or are we becoming increasingly fragmented in our approaches, in your opinion?
It may well be best to slow shoulders on that for a second. The answer to that will depend on the American elections in November, which perhaps says something about the underlying problems that beset the Western alliance and approach, a rules-based system approach that we say we aspire to. I think the Ukraine has shown that there's a well of unity there based upon what's perceived as a common threat. Is it fraying now? Yeah. Is that because of boredom or because of any sort of realization there is limited threat? Difficult to say, and I don't know. I haven't spoken to enough people in Europe about that. But certainly, I think if we've discussed this 4 or 5 years ago, so I was getting a bit rudderless. Ukraine has set a course. Will we stick to that course? We should discuss it in a year's time, well, just over a year's time. And, the direction of the American administration becomes clear. Their priority, of course, is not our priority, which is seeing China there. It doesn't matter which president is elected. Their priority is not ours, though, and that's China. And they have taken a very adversarial perspective on the People's Republic of China, which we don't. There's an argument to be had about that. So the picture is very mixed. There's certainly the potential, I think, for a unified European perspective if we're willing to lead on that to the extent we can. I think one of the problems is we're going to, because of the catastrophic, it might be a failure of capability over the last couple of decades of displacement activity that in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, and what have you, which sort of back that up. We may lose leadership in Europe. I know there are moves by Poland to start thinking about removing our role as essentially our role as DSACUR. We have a consistent post.
That's the Deputy Commander of NATO.
Yeah, it looks as if, and I can see why the Poles may say, well, look what the British can offer to NATO in terms of capability, and look what we can offer. And they're offering serious muscle in a way that we can't anymore. And why should they pay any attention to our supposed special relationship, which evidently no longer exists, part because we've allowed our capabilities to atrophy. So it may well be that Britain's leadership role, to the extent we have one in Europe, would be even more compromised. Challenge is always was by France anyway. But there's a new power in Europe now, and that's Poland. And they will lead.
Can the claim of a coherent or at least cooperative strategic vision be directed at our adversaries as well, or is that hyperbole, do you think? Do you think Iran, Russia, China and so forth, North Korea, are developing a loose axis, for want of a better term, or is that fear overblown?
I think the fear of an axis is overblown, but they're certainly picking holes in the rules-based order that we profess to adhere to. Whether it's the degree to which it's coherent or organised, I think is highly questionable. I think Russia has a coherent strategic vision. What that is, my view is, it's probably what Putin articulates. But I don't want to put money on that. Rather hedge my bets by building up capabilities to deter anything further. And as for China, the question there is, do they aspire to global hegemony, global power? Even they wouldn't claim hegemony, or local hegemony. And I suspect we should take them at their word. By 2049 they want to build armed forces that are, in their words, world class, which is to say, challenge the United States, making a bipolar, even more bipolar world. So that's the distant future, where there is a coherence. Of course, that's dependent on China's economy and of course, on decisions that may be made in the next few years about Taiwan, South China Sea, or indeed contingencies that may occur in either of those places or others.
Firstly, with your optimistic hat on, and secondly, with your pessimistic hat on, where do you think the UK Armed Forces will be by the end of the decade?
Optimistic hat. A new government, and I'm not making a political point here, but I will say this. Labour has tended to be, as you know, more forgiving of the military in terms of resources allocated to them than the Tories, because they perceive themselves to be at a disadvantage for some reason in the defence realm. And as I say, I have no political axe to grind on this. So let's assume that Labour allocates some more resources, insisting, of course, as they should and must, those resources are properly accountable, which is a forlorn hope, I think. But let's assume that. I think we could see the Air Force start to develop an adequate integrated air and missile defence system. They may well invest far more in their agile combat employment strategy, which is coming on, I think, to be fair. I would like to see, for deterrent purposes, a deployment of a medium to long-range air defence system, in addition to the fighters, in the form perhaps of SAMP-T or even Patriot, very expensive that, to provide us with a layered air defence system. It's possible, it's unlikely, it's very expensive. Perhaps at sea, pressing on with and fulfilling the commitments concerning the construction of Type 26 frigates, which look like they're really going to be capable of very good ships. Perhaps adding another 4 to that roster. I would want to see at least one of the carriers decommissioned or used, perhaps in an innovative role as either a drone base or considering doing something really sort of forward-leaning, like as the Italians are doing with their own carriers, which is considering using it as a mobile space launch facility. So Garibaldi, they're considering for that. And to the extent the other carriers are useful, focusing that and the rest of the Navy on the defence of sea lanes and the homeland. And with respect to the Army, it would be nice to see them able to, and I think they will probably try to do this, fulfil their obligations of constructing and being able to deploy, which is a very different thing, an effective and combat division. Above all, though, and this is a bit self-serving, I was a reservist for many, many years, nearly 20 years, really looking at the engagement of our people in defence. Now, whether that takes, I don't think it should take the form, nobody really does, of conscription, but perhaps offering some form of short reserve service, as the Taiwanese do or did until recently, or the Swedes do or did. It's just to provide a link, and above all, treat them like human beings and equals instead of the general attitude of defence to reservists, which in the words of which in my case as a naval reservist is really not required. And second-class, third-class citizens of defence, these people should be treated as first-class citizens of defence and the future. Because if push comes to shove, those are the ones you're going to have to rely on to replace the losses that you sustain. So that engagement with the people, which I don't think would be expensive, be very unpopular in the military, but it would be relatively inexpensive, I think should be another priority. And I understand, I would imagine defence are looking at that. So that would be the optimistic view. More engaged reserves, perhaps not particularly capable, but basically trained, a lot of them. Expanded Navy, the Army continuing on its road, fulfilling its undertakings without any more procurement disasters, and an Air Force with, for the nerds, 7 E-7 early warning aircraft, a new air defence capability alongside the Army, layered air defences, and Pessimistic. I think things could get very bad. Let's say the new government doesn't allocate new resources. The army has said it might be able to deploy a division in the mid-30s. The Air Force will bumble along with platforms it can't really use, like 56 Chinooks. Therefore, and a Navy which can deploy 15 or so escort vessels. And above all, my pessimistic hat would see a continuation of global military Britain, so that all of those assets are dispersed globally and incapable of achieving any significant effect at all.
I get the feeling I know which scenario you think is more likely.
Yeah.
But, well, on that delightfully pessimistic note, Frank Ledwidge, thank you much for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure, as always, talking to you.